Welcome back to another episode of Cracking the Show with Psychological Science. We're going to pick up right now with the second half of our interview with Dr. Yamalis Diaz, where she's going to share some of her insights into ADHD. So let's learn about putting the pizzazz back in the pizzazle. Can we talk about ADHD?
Sure. One of my favorite topics.
So can you give us a brief description of ADHD and maybe its associated symptoms?
Let me start by saying that people still call it ADD sometimes, and it's sort of known now. ADD is like a retired term for what is now called ADHD, predominantly inattentive subtype. So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and it has essentially three subtypes. The predominantly inattentive subtype is what is formerly known as ADD, or attention deficit disorder. The predominantly hyperactive impulsive subtype, which is mostly seen in really young children, and then the combined subtype. And basically what these clusters represent is sort of what is your symptom profile, right? So there's three sort of categories of symptoms. Symptoms of inattention, disorganization, forgetfulness, distractibility. Symptoms of hyperactivity, essentially restlessness, fidgeting, difficulty staying seated, always being on the go, and symptoms of impulsivity, basically doing and saying things without thinking, just doing things very quickly and abruptly. And so each subtype represents like what is the predominant picture for you. Do you have trouble with focusing and distractibility, but not so much hyperactive impulsive symptoms? Is it mostly hyperactive impulsive symptoms, but not really so much inattention? And then the sort of combined subtype is you have difficulties with both of those sort of general clusters, the inattention and the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. And basically, it is a neurological condition. We know that there are very specific differences in the brain, both functionally, structurally, right? So the way that the brain works, and also structurally in terms of how the brain is sort of constructed, or how big or small different parts might be. And then also neurochemically, there are certain chemicals in the brain that are low or high, dopamine being one of the most significant ones. And so it really shows up. We know that it's a neurological condition, but what we really, really care about is how does this show up in actual behavior in day-to-day life?
Yes.
How does it impact you? And does it cause any challenges? And so one of the criteria for diagnosing ADHD is that it actually causes functional impairment in daily living in at least two major areas of your life. And so it's very real. It definitely has some challenges associated.
So for kids, can you give us some examples of like what those areas of daily life? You said two, but there could be tens of different. Yeah.
Yes.
So what does that look like?
Definitely academically is probably one of the biggest and most significant impacts. For kids who are naturally very bright, sometimes the academic impairment doesn't show up until much later. Essentially, they sort of get by. But when you really pay attention to what they're producing and how focused they are in the classroom, it's clear that it's impacting their learning, their ability to take in, stay focused, and also their ability to produce work. So academic impairment is definitely typically a part of it. Social impairment, there's a lot of sort of behaviors that can be off-putting to peers. Annoying is a word we hear often used. Too loud, too touchy, too in your face, too bossy, whatever it may be. And so it can be really impactful to their friendships. And then at home, it is very challenging to parent a child with ADHD. Exuberant and beautiful and lovely as their brains may be, and there are some really beautiful strengths to this brain, it is really challenging to parent a child with ADHD, right? You might have to repeat the same instruction 10 times. Every routine is challenging. Everything takes longer. So it just feels like you're parenting like 3 kids for the price of 1. And so that can be really hard. So a lot of parenting, a lot of family challenges, and that those are probably the 3 major ones. But maybe to add one more, the child's self-esteem often takes quite a hit. Yeah. They eventually start picking up what everybody is giving them feedback about. Typically that feedback is not positive, and they start sort of absorbing it enough to feel like, there's something wrong with me, and that's an unfortunate side effect as well.
Yeah.
So, one thing we didn't really touch on are the strengths of the ADHD brain, right? Sometimes I lament talking about the challenges that come with ADHD because they know what they are. The families know what they are. The kids know what they are. It's hard to watch sometimes because you can just see that there is very real struggle. And so we need to address the challenges. However, man, oh man, is this brain beautiful. It is so profoundly large. There's just so many things that this brain is clearly very good at. Sometimes you can see that there's like mini engineers and mini architects just brewing in there. Even just watching them create Lego structures, if you just watch them work. If you listen sometimes to their train of thought, you can hear the problem solving, the connection of dots, because it's almost like the brain can hold more pieces of information at the same time. So you can see that they can sort of connect things.
So kind of like thinking outside the box is a little bit more natural.
Absolutely. Creative problem solving. It's beautiful to watch. And so if you can channel that and sort of really try to understand some of those strengths, maximize those while managing the challenges, I mean, you can put these kids on a real path of discovery. And it's really exciting to watch that happen too. So I really hate when kids and families just feel like gloom and doom, that, oh gosh, my child has ADHD, which means they're not going to learn, they're not going to succeed, they're going to be doomed to failure. And it's like, no, it does not have to be that. It absolutely can be a really wonderful path, as long as they find their thing, whatever that is.
What can parents do to help their kids manage ADHD?
So many things. This is actually one of the best treatments for ADHD is behavioral therapy. And when we think about behavioral therapy, what we're really doing is teaching parents and teachers in particular, the two sort of major adults in their lives, to structure the environment in a way that really helps that ADHD brain function and do what it needs to do, right? So good structured routines instead of leaving things too open-ended. The ADHD brain does really well with structured routines, very clear expectations and rules with very clear consequences, positive and negative consequences. So rewards for good things and good meeting certain goals, and consistent negative consequences for things like not complying with instructions, being a more oppositional or argumentative, that kind of thing. And so even just some of those very basic changes, it's nothing, out of the ordinary, but for kids with ADHD, it's kind of like you need to be like a super parent, whereas for kids without ADHD, you can sort of wing it in some ways to some extent, and they still do pretty okay. Kids with ADHD really need a structured approach to the way that they're being managed.
Yeah, just quickly before I hand it off to Joey, but is there a heritability component to this?
There is. So upwards of 50%, meaning that typically 50% of kids with ADHD or a little higher will have at least one parent with ADHD, and if not directly a parent, then maybe a grandparent or a pretty close relative. What's tricky is that ADHD wasn't recognized as well, maybe wasn't diagnosed or assessed as often in past generations, and so we often find that we're sort of noticing and diagnosing ADHD in a child, and then the parents are like, wait a second, this sounds an awful lot like me, and then it sort of, if we think about their experience, it turns out that they probably also had ADHD that just was never evaluated.
So how about options for treatment? We know psychological testing can be so expensive, right? It can be really expensive, and it's not always even covered by, insurance, right? Depending on insurance. Are there ways for parents to get their kids tested that, doesn't break the bank, and what's currently the state of science on treatment options that are available?
Well, to clarify one thing, which I think it gets confused for people, is when we think about an evaluation for ADHD and we use the word testing, for example, a lot of people think like neuropsychological evaluation, which is a battery of tests that look at IQ, achievement, and other cognitive processes. It's a very extensive test that we do to really understand a child's cognitive, intellectual abilities. That can absolutely diagnose ADHD, but isn't necessary for diagnosing ADHD. And so when we think of a neuropsych evaluation, which is very expensive and sometimes is not covered by insurance, that is not the only way to diagnose ADHD, and in fact, not necessary for diagnosing ADHD. The sort of standard approach to diagnosing ADHD is to do a good developmental history with a trained mental health professional. So it's basically an interview with the parents, an interview with the child, and then you collect some additional information from the child's teacher, some standardized rating scales. That in and of itself can give you a really good picture and help you diagnose ADHD. And a good evaluation should also make sure that it's ruling out other things that can look like ADHD but are not ADHD, right? Anxiety can look like ADHD.
Right.
Trauma can look like ADHD. So we also want to rule some of those out. So that those evaluations tend to be covered by insurance at a much higher rate than a neuropsychological evaluation.
That's really helpful. It's a really helpful distinction.
Yeah, in terms of the treatment options, we hear a lot about the use of like Ritalin or Adderall. Are those the two main pharmacological interventions, or what else is there available?
Yeah, I think the two sort of primary interventions for ADHD are the behavioral therapy that I described and the use of stimulant medications or non-stimulant options that can also be considered. But what we recommend, especially for younger children, but really for any children who are eventually going to be on medication or parents are considering medication, it should not be done in the absence of behavioral therapy, right? It should not be medication only. But medication, when used in combination with behavioral therapy, can absolutely be a game changer, right? I'm a psychologist. I do not prescribe. I have no reason to suggest medication. It doesn't benefit me at all. And yet, I often recommend that parents consider medication when behavioral therapy alone is just not going to do enough to prevent the accumulating impairment that is occurring for this child. It's like by the time we slow this down, a lot of things are going to have already, sort of accumulated, and that can be really tough. So medication can really be a game changer for kids academically in particular, but also socially, and it can also really have a nice impact on how parents feel when managing their child's behavior.
Well, so managing the ADHD symptoms with cognitive behavioral therapy sounds like a natural way of dealing with this while still enjoying the benefits. Does the medication route limit those? I mean, does that really sort of clamp down on that?
The medication absolutely can sort of bring that a little bit down, and
okay, so a little bit, okay,
a little bit, right? But it is true. Like sometimes, I actually just had a girl tell me that when she's on medication and she feels like it takes away her pizazzle. And
that's a great word.
Yeah, I said, what's pizazzle? And she's like, you know what I mean. It's kind of like, my pizazzle. She could not give me a definition, but obviously we all know what pizazzle is. We all know what the pizazzle is. And so I think, yes, it makes the brain sort of close some of those doors that don't need to be open and really focus in on just keeping the brain a little more efficient and focused. And so, yes, it takes away some of that bippity-bopness that happens in the brain. However, the medication is only active for a certain number of hours per day when they need to be focused. We don't need pizazzle when we're trying to focus in math class. Right?
All right. So I think we've just identified a couple of new criteria for the DSM. Do you have that pizazzle? Do you have that bibbidi-bopness?
Yes. Those are both, in my mind, those are symptoms of ADHD.
Yeah,
right?
Positive symptoms.
Yes, absolutely. Then they do tend to be funny, outgoing, they talk to everyone kind of thing. Yeah,
right.
It's a actually, I mentioned to you guys that there was a documentary that I was in.
Oh, yes.
That I think did such a nice job of trying to highlight both the challenges and the beautiful strengths and how you can really do some wonderful things. It's called The Disruptors. And they essentially...
Wait, who produced this again?
I actually am not sure what the production company, but it's I should know what the actual production company is called. But I forget.
And where can you watch it?
You can. It's streaming everywhere. I don't think it's on Netflix, but I do think it's on Hulu, Tubi, Prime Video.
Okay.
So you can see it on most streaming platforms.
Was that Gayle King? What was her role?
No, she just we launched it on her show.
Oh, okay. By the way, another psych terp. Cool little fun fact.
Know. I should send her an email and be like, we met. Gayle, do you remember we met? And we're both terps. I think the documentary I thought did such a nice job because it used celebrities as well. People like Paris Hilton, Steve Madden, who's a shoe maker. Will.i.am, who's a famous songwriter, singer, producer, and really what they wanted to do was highlight like how you can take all of this amazing ADHD energy and channel it. And that, I think, is the goal of good treatment, is just let's keep the challenges in check. There's things that you just have to do that your brain doesn't want to really do because it's boring to you, fine, but you still have to get those things done. And then let's see if we can find your pizazzle and set it free. Yeah.
What do you think about, some social psychologists talk a lot about, kind of the impact of technology, on mental health, but also, specifically in the context of ADHD, and social psychologists, of course, are not clinicians, but some social psychologists, posit potential detrimental effects and impacts with technology use, specifically screen time, with, young children. I don't know if you, I was curious to hear, if you have any thoughts on that, because it's a big topic.
Yeah, it is a very big topic. And I think we're going to see more and more science emerging that suggests that there's a very real impact. For one, we know that the younger kids are when they start using technology, the more impact it has on things like their attention span, their ability to stay focused on any one thing, because those games, et cetera, it's like a constant switching of things happening in the brain. And so I think some science is already starting to come out on the shortening attention span of children, and it's at least being partially linked to their early screen time use. It's almost like it's sort of wiring the brain a little differently at very sensitive points of development. So I guess the argument would be that if we're just going to have more generations of kids who start using screens earlier, what are the implications for how we measure attention spans? What's considered a poor attention span if everybody has a poor attention span? But I think there is some very real concern about how much it actually does impact kids' ability to stay focused, work on one thing for a while, not be so actively entertained all the time, because that's the other piece of it, is screen time use is like very active on the brain. And so they can't tolerate lower levels of stimulation. It has to be like full on, where they essentially get understimulated, which is the equivalent of bored. And then they can't tolerate the boredom. But, the other interesting thing is that ADHD is linked to low dopamine production. And dopamine is our feel-good neurochemical that sort of makes us focused, attentive, engaged, excited. And ADHD brains essentially don't have enough. So when they find the source that does produce that dopamine response, it's like they are in their happy place. And usually that will be something related to technology, can activate the dopamine circuitry so well that they're like, I have to have it.
And they're able to maybe focus, maybe even hyper focus, right?
Exactly, yeah, because it really pulls the brain in. This can be really confusing to parents. They're like, my child can't have ADHD. They can focus on their video games for hours, but as soon as they have to read, and it's like, well, when they're reading, the brain is not producing dopamine. When they're actively engaged, it's like basically in euphoria.
That's what's producing the reward.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and if you're somebody with ADHD, then your normal experience is really understimulated. It's bored. It's uncomfortable. And then when you find your happy place, it's like, well, I really have to do this more often, which is why it can be really concerning. For somebody without ADHD, at least in your normal state, you can still produce dopamine and still feel good about things and tolerate the understimulation. So they really glom on, and there's a lot of concern about how much children with ADHD in particular use screens, but really all kids.
Yeah, and it reminds me also too, right, that this is not just a one-way street, because technology adapts to the brain that's adapting to the technology. And so there's this feedback loop that just shortens the amount of information coming in, which shortens the attention span, and very interesting and fascinating topic. Okay, one last question before we close this down, and that is, if people want to tune into your SiriusXM show, what's the name of it?
Sure, it's about our kids, live every Friday morning from 8 to 10 a.m. on SiriusXM channel 110.
That's awesome. Yamalis, this is awesome.
Yep, this is
great.
This
is like
this
is a wonderful interview, and I'm glad we could have you on, and I'm super glad that the campus, the the college was able to bring you in, and also thank you for all the work you're doing for the University of Maryland. You're not getting paid for it.
No, but it's a thank you, and if I may, sort of also really say thank you to the University of Maryland for taking a chance on me. I was not probably the most prepared a graduate student coming in because I figured out my psychology path late. So compared to other students, I probably wasn't as prepared, didn't have as much experience. But man, did they turn my life into a career and a fulfilled career that I can be really, really thankful for. So big shout out to Dr. Andrea Cronus Toscano, who was my advisor in the University of Maryland, for giving me that shot.
Yep, and success has many flavors, and you're like so many of those flavors all rolled up into one. So
thank you.
It's been wonderful.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, peace out.
Peace out.
All right. That was super fun.
That was fun. Please have me back.
We will.
Oh, we will.
We'll definitely have you back. We will. This was very informative. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we can just keep on chatting and stuff like that because we do some trail-ons.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
No, really, I appreciate it.